I've lived long enough to know that markets move on whispers, panic rises on rumors, and history has a funny way of circling back to old lessons we never fully learned. But even after 9 decades of watching this country swing between certainty and chaos, I will tell you something plainly. I did not expect to wake up this morning to a news alert staring back at me. Supreme Court blocks Trump's tariffs. White House in panic. It's 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time. And the financial world just stopped breathing. The Supreme Court has delivered a verdict that nobody, not Wall Street, not Washington, not even the White House, saw coming this fast. Trump's tariffs blocked, frozen, declared unconstitutional, and within minutes the panic began. But there's one man who's been watching this storm build for months. A 94-year-old legend who's lived through 9 decades of American economic chaos. A man who predicted this exact moment would arrive. His name, Warren Buffett. And what he just said should terrify every politician in Washington. This is the story of how America's most powerful trade weapon was just ripped out of the president's hands, and what happens next could reshape the entire economy. I read it twice, then a third time, and in that moment, the first thought that passed through my mind wasn't about stocks or currency markets or whether the price of copper futures would jump by noon. No, the first thought was far simpler. This is what happens when a nation stretches executive power so far that the judicial branch finally says enough. My name is Warren Buffett, and I've seen presidents impose tariffs before. I watched Richard Nixon do it in the 1,970 seconds. I watched Ronald Reagan do it to protect the steel and chip industries, and I watched Donald Trump embrace tariffs not as a surgical tool but as a blunt instrument, a weapon really used against adversaries, allies, and in some cases America's own consumers. But I have never seen the Supreme Court step in the way it just did. Let's rewind to this morning. Most Americans were pouring their first cup coffee. Traders were settling into their desks. And somewhere in Omaha, Nebraska, Warren Buffett was doing what he does every morning, reading. And then his phone lit up, and in his own words, which we're hearing directly from him, his first thought wasn't about stocks or currency markets or even the billions of dollars about to shift hands. His first thought was simpler and far more chilling. This is what happens when a nation stretches executive power so far that the judicial branch finally says enough. But let's be clear, this didn't happen overnight. This is the climax of a battle that's been raging behind closed doors for over a year. A battle between presidential authority, constitutional limits, and an economy that's been held hostage by tariffs that were supposed to make America great again, but instead made everything more expensive. And from where I sit, desks stacked with annual reports, market data, and letters from CEOs who spent months begging for clarity, this decision didn't fall from the sky. This was a storm cloud that had been building for months, maybe even years, and anyone who bothered to look could have seen the lightning forming. For weeks, the justices had been signaling their reluctance in comments leaked from oral arguments. Several conservative members of the bench, including Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, questioned whether the president could use emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on everything from steel to tomatoes. And when the lower courts ruled that Trump had exceeded statutory authority using the IEPA framework, it was a matter of time before the highest court confronted the same question. Can a president turn economic policy into permanent emergency action? Today they finally answered, and the answer was no, not anymore. To understand today's earthquake, we need to go back to where it all started. When Donald Trump returned to office, tariffs became his signature weapon. Steel, aluminum, tomatoes, electronics, nothing was off limits. The justification? National security, economic emergency, protection of American workers. But here's what most people didn't see. Behind the patriotic slogans, the tariffs were built on shaky legal ground. Trump was using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law designed for short-term crises, not permanent trade policy. And Warren Buffett noticed in private letters to CEOs, in quiet conversations with senators, Buffett warned, you can't run an economy on emergency powers. Eventually, someone will challenge this. And when they do, the whole structure will collapse. He was right. The decision delivered with unusual speed for a case of such magnitude essentially froze the entire tariff structure the White House had been defending. It didn't erase all tariffs, but it dismantled the legal foundation on which the most controversial ones were built. For a government dependent on these duties to fund political promises and trade wars simultaneously, this was nothing short of a direct hit. So yes, I believe the White House panicked because for the first time since Donald Trump returned to office, the courts reminded him that the Constitution still has a voice. Over the past 18 months, grocery prices rose by double digits. Manufacturing costs skyrocketed. CEOs rewrote their pricing models 11 times in 7 months. Farmers watched their soybeans rot in silos while China bought from Brazil. One CEO told Buffett directly, Warren, I can't build a 5-year plan when Washington changes the rules every 9 weeks. And all the while, the legal challenges were piling up. Lower courts began ruling that Trump had exceeded his statutory authority. Conservative justices like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh started asking uncomfortable questions. Can a president turn economic policy into permanent emergency action? Today, the Supreme Court answered, and the answer was a resounding no. Now, let me speak plainly. When tariffs were first introduced under the current administration, I said something that frustrated a lot of people on television. I said the policy felt like an act of war, not because it involved guns or tanks, but because it weaponized trade. It turned what should have been negotiations into threats, and threats into bills paid by the American consumer. People forget this. A tariff is a tax, and a tax doesn't fall on foreign governments. It falls on farmers in Nebraska, on manufacturers in Ohio, on single mothers shopping at Walmart in Mississippi. When you raise the price of input goods, you eventually raise the price of everything produced from them. It's simple math, the kind I learned delivering newspapers as a kid. So, what exactly did the Supreme Court do? In a decision delivered with unusual speed, the court didn't just slap Trump's wrist, they dismantled the entire legal foundation his tariffs were built on. The court ruled that President Trump had exceeded his statutory authority by using emergency powers to impose sweeping long-term tariffs. The IEEPA framework was never meant for this. It was meant for actual emergencies, not as a permanent trade weapon. The ruling effectively froze the tariff structure. It didn't erase every single duty, but it pulled the rug out from under the most controversial ones, the ones affecting everything from steel to consumer electronics. And here's the kicker. The decision opens the door for tens of billions of dollars in refund claims. Companies that paid these tariffs, now deemed unlawful, could demand their money back. Some estimates put that number at over $80 billion. That's not a typo. $80 billion. For a government already walking a fiscal tightrope, this is a disaster. There's something else I should address because most Americans don't fully grasp it. The Supreme Court's decision may trigger tens of billions of dollars in refund claims from companies that paid tariffs later deemed unlawful. Some estimates suggest the federal government could face obligations exceeding $80 billion. That's a staggering figure, and it's going to force Congress to confront a fiscal problem they didn't plan for. But here's the truth. Those refunds aren't a bailout or a handout. They're simply the return of money that should never have been collected in the first place. If someone takes your wallet by mistake and then gives it back, you don't call it charity, you call it correcting an error. And make no mistake, the error here was not made by importers or consumers. It was made by policymakers who used economic emergency tools as permanent fixtures. The court didn't strike down tariffs because tariffs are inherently unconstitutional. It struck them down because the process for implementing them violated statutory boundaries. That distinction matters. A president can still negotiate trade agreements. Congress can still authorize targeted duties, but what can't continue is the practice of treating temporary emergency measures as permanent solutions. Within minutes of the ruling, the White House went into crisis mode. Advisors scrambled, legal teams huddled, and President Trump, according to sources close to the administration, he was furious. Press briefings were hastily arranged. Spokespersons appeared on every major network, promising that the administration would fight aggressively and use every tool at its disposal. There was talk of invoking the Trade Expansion Act, hints at national security exceptions, even whispers of daring Congress to restore tariff authority on grounds of patriotism. As I watched commentators describe the White House reaction as panic, I couldn't help but think back to 2008 during the financial crisis. Panic was everywhere. Banks collapsing, credit freezing, millions losing homes. Panic was real then because the system itself was breaking. Today's panic, however, is political. It's the panic that comes when a strategy built on executive dominance suddenly crashes into a constitutional wall. And here's something I've said 100 times, but I'll say again. Markets survive bad news, but they fear unpredictability. This ruling resets the playing field. It forces a conversation that should have happened years ago. What role should tariffs play in a modern economy, and who has the authority to decide? But Warren Buffett watched all of this and saw something different. He saw improvisation, panic dressed up as confidence. As one White House spokesperson spoke with forced conviction on live TV, Buffett said to himself, "This isn't strength. This isn't strategy. This is what happens when a plan collapses faster than anyone expected." Because here's the truth. The White House knew this ruling was coming. Advisors had been warning Trump for months that the legal justification for his tariffs was fragile. But the warnings were ignored. Why? Because tariffs had become more than policy. They'd become a symbol, a pillar of Trump's economic identity, a promise to his base that he was fighting for American workers. And now that pillar has been kicked out from under him. Tonight, I imagine Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, and the White House legal team are already drafting backup plans. I imagine members of Congress are planning hearings on presidential power. I imagine businesses across the country are rewriting their Q4 guidance. And I imagine that tomorrow morning, millions of Americans will wake up to prices that still haven't fallen because judicial decisions don't move supply chains overnight. But I also imagine something else. I imagine that years from now, we might look back at today as the moment when the United States finally recalibrated its approach to trade, a moment when the courts reminded the executive branch that economic warfare carries costs, and those costs eventually fall on the people who can least afford them. Over the past year, companies I've invested in, from retailers to industrial suppliers, have sent me letter after letter telling me how hard it had become to operate under shifting tariff regimes. One CEO wrote that he'd updated his pricing structure 11 times in 7 months. He said, "Warren, I can't build a 5-year plan when Washington changes the rules every 9 weeks." He was right. This chaos has real consequences, not just for businesses, but for retirees, young families, and anyone with a paycheck tied to the cost of goods. And that's why today's Supreme Court ruling landed like a thunderclap across the markets. A trader once told me, "Uncertainty is the enemy." Well, this morning the court removed one layer of uncertainty and added 3 new ones on top. Let's talk about who really paid for these tariffs. Spoiler alert, it wasn't China. Despite what you've heard on cable news, tariffs don't punish foreign governments. They punish American consumers. Here's how it works. When Trump slapped a 25% tariff on imported steel, American companies didn't just absorb the cost, they passed it on. Car prices went up, appliances went up, construction materials went up. A refrigerator that cost $800 last year, now it's $1,000. Farm equipment, up 15 to 20%. And who felt it most? Not billionaires, not CEOs, working families, single parents, retirees on fixed incomes. Within minutes of the decision coming out, my phone lit up. Traders, analysts, CEOs, economists, and some of them asked the same question: Warren, is this good news or bad news? Let me be honest with you, that's not an easy question. The ruling creates clarity about the limits of presidential authority, and that's a good thing for rule of law. But it also exposes a fragile economy that had been leaning heavily on tariffs like a crutch. Remove that crutch too quickly, and you risk seeing the patient wobble. If you think this ruling is the end of the tariff war, you'd be mistaken. It's just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which Congress, the White House, and the courts wrestle over who controls trade in the 21st century. So how did Wall Street react? In a word, chaos. Within minutes of the Supreme Court announcement, trading volumes spiked. Some stocks soared, particularly retailers and consumer goods companies that had been crushed by tariff costs, but others plunged. Defense contractors, steel manufacturers, and companies that had restructured their entire business models around the tariff system, they got hammered. Traders were calling Buffett all morning. Analysts, CEOs, economists, everyone asking the same question: Warren, is this good news or bad news? And here's what Buffett told them. That's not an easy question. The ruling creates clarity about the limits of presidential authority, and that's good for the rule of law. But it also exposes a fragile economy that had been leaning heavily on tariffs like a crutch. Remove that crutch too quickly, and you risk seeing the patient wobble. In my lifetime, I've never seen a moment when all three branches pulled in different directions at once. And let me tell you something I've learned after 80 years of investing. When Washington fights itself, Wall Street gets nervous. And when Wall Street gets nervous, Main Street eventually pays the price. As I watched the news scroll across the bottom of the television screen, I saw a split screen showing President Trump pacing in the Oval Office while commentators speculated about options and workarounds. Some analysts suggested he might try to revive tariffs under the Trade Expansion Act or invoke national security exceptions the way President Bush once did for steel. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But I will say this: every time a president uses legal loopholes to push economic policy, the country loses a little more trust in the system. Trust is one of the most valuable currencies a nation can possess. Lose it, and you lose more than money. You lose stability, investment, and confidence. Here's something most Americans don't realize. The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to regulate trade. Article 1, Section 8, it's right there in black and white. But over the past few decades, Congress has been more than happy to let presidents take the wheel. Why? Because trade policy is messy. It's politically risky. And if it goes wrong, it's easier to blame the White House than take responsibility. But today's Supreme Court ruling just shattered that comfortable arrangement, because now Congress has to answer a question it's been avoiding for years: who actually controls trade in the 21st century? I know some people will cheer this ruling as a victory against Trump. Others will condemn it as judicial overreach. But from where I sit, this isn't about personalities. It's about balance. A balance that has been tilting dangerously for years. People ask me if I'm happy about the ruling. Happiness isn't the word I'd use. I'm relieved that we have institutions strong enough to say no, even when saying no is politically explosive. But I'm also aware that the road ahead will be bumpy. Investors don't like surprises, and this was a big one. Within hours of the decision, lawmakers started appearing on TV. Some called for legislative hearings on presidential power. Others promised swift action to protect American workers. But Warren Buffett isn't holding his breath. He knows that in an election year, courage is in short supply. One senator, a Midwest Republican, texted Buffett this afternoon, Warren, the court just gave us cover. Now we have to act. That's what judicial decisions can do. They create political permission. But let me be direct. Congress should have asserted its authority years ago. This ruling exposes how complacent legislators have become comfortable letting the executive expand its power far beyond original boundaries. The Constitution places trade squarely within congressional authority. Somewhere along the way, that thread was lost, and now in the middle of an election cycle, that thread has been forcibly rewound. For now, though, all I can offer is experience. I've seen America survive recessions, wars, political upheaval, and crises far worse than this, and I believe it will survive this too. But what happens next depends not on the court, not on traders, and not on analysts. It depends on whether our leaders choose to govern through clarity or through chaos. Because today the court took the first step toward clarity. The question now is whether anyone in Washington will follow. And as I sit here looking out the window of my office in Omaha, watching the sun begin to dip behind the skyline, I find myself thinking of something my father told me when I was young. When the powerful fight, the ordinary foot the bill. I can only hope that today's ruling means fewer Americans will be stuck paying that bill. When the news broke and the world started spinning a little faster, I did what I've always done in uncertain moments. I reached for perspective. Perspective doesn't show up on a Bloomberg terminal, and you can't download it from an earnings report. It comes from decades of watching human behavior react to pressure, power, and the unexpected. In the hours after the Supreme Court's decision reverberated across the country, I spent time thinking about how we got here, not just legally or politically, but emotionally, because whether we admit it or not, economic policy is often driven as much by fear as by strategy. And if you've listened carefully to the tone coming from Washington this past year, you'd know that fear has been the engine driving much of the tariff machinery. The decision delivered by the court was not a quiet document filed away in a PDF. It was a direct, unmistakable signal. The message was simple. The executive branch cannot stretch emergency powers like a rubber band until they finally snap. For months, the White House insisted the tariffs were necessary to fight foreign manipulation, protect American workers, and restore balance with China, Mexico, and half a dozen other nations. Behind the scenes, however, what many people didn't see was the rising anxiety within the administration. Advisors warned President Trump that the legal justification for the sweeping tariffs was fragile. I know this not from gossip, but from conversations with business leaders who visited officials and came back shaking their heads, stunned at how aggressively the administration was trying to hold together a structure built on emergency statutes rather than legislative approval. As I listened to analysts dissect the ruling on CNBC, I found myself reflecting on an old truth. Markets can adjust to almost any reality as long as they understand the rules. What markets cannot handle is unpredictability, the kind of unpredictability that forces CEOs to rewrite their entire financial plans because of a press conference or sudden declaration. One CEO told me recently, Warren, every time the White House announced a new tariff, I had to stop production until I knew what my supply chain costs would be. Sometimes the rules change twice in the same quarter, and no business can thrive under those conditions, not even the strongest. But the most important part of today's drama may not be the ruling itself, it's the reaction. Within hours, the White House legal team scrambled to issue statements promising alternative pathways to restore the tariffs. Senior advisors appeared on television insisting President Trump would fight aggressively and use every tool at his disposal. There were hints of invoking renewed national security justifications and even some murmurs of daring Congress to reinstate tariff authority on grounds of patriotism. As I watched one spokesperson speak with a tone of forced confidence, I thought to myself, this is not strength. This is not strategy. This is improvisation, the kind that happens when a plan collapses faster than anyone expected. People often confuse noise with leadership. But noise is just noise, and this administration has produced enough of it to drown out the very conversations we should have been having long before the Supreme Court stepped in. I've spent decades studying competitive dynamics, and whether you're running a railroad, a candy company, or a nation, the principle is the same. Predictability creates prosperity. The more predictable your environment, the more people invest. The more they invest, the more the economy grows. That's not ideology. It's human nature paired with math. But tariffs disrupt predictability. They inject friction into the economic bloodstream, and they hit the people least able to absorb shocks. When I saw reporters gather outside the White House fence today, and when I heard one shout, "Is the president worried about market reaction?" I paused the television and answered out loud, even though no one else was in the room, he should be worried about the reaction from regular Americans, because while the Supreme Court struck down the legal basis of the tariffs, the real impact will ripple through the lives of families who spent the past year paying more for groceries, appliances, farm equipment, and everything made from imported materials. As the sun set over Omaha tonight, I found myself thinking about a factory worker in Ohio, a soybean farmer in Iowa, a grocery store manager in Tennessee. They didn't sit in oral arguments. They didn't read the decision. Most of them won't have time to watch a full segment on it, but they will feel the consequences in prices, in job security, in the stability of the companies that employ them. Economic decisions made in Washington often roll downhill, and when they reach the bottom, it's ordinary households that absorb the momentum. This is what worries me most, not the politics, not the headlines, but the families. I remember sitting with Charlie Munger years before he passed, talking about how political decisions often disguise themselves as economic policy. Charlie said, "Warren, most people think tariffs punish foreign governments. They don't. They punish domestic citizens." He was right. He was always right. The political arena, however, tends to frame tariffs as symbols of strength, tools to teach China a lesson or bring manufacturing home. But manufacturing doesn't relocate because of slogans. It relocates because of capital efficiency, labor specialization, and supply chain reliability. Tariffs can shift calculations, but rarely in the way politicians imagine. In many cases, tariffs incentivize companies to move somewhere else, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, rather than back to the United States. This is the nuance that doesn't fit neatly into political speeches. Because the truth is, America has been drifting into economic tribalism. Every party wants to claim the moral high ground, yet very few want to look at actual outcomes. If policy doesn't improve the lives of working people, it doesn't matter how loud the speeches are or how sharp the tweets read. The Supreme Court ruling is a constitutional correction, but it's also a mirror, one that forces both parties to ask uncomfortable questions. For example, if tariffs were supposed to protect American manufacturing, why did so many factories cut jobs during the tariff era? If tariffs were meant to weaken China, why did Chinese exports to the United States shift through third countries instead, barely slowing at all? If tariffs were meant to raise government revenue, why did the same policies worsen consumer inflation, disproportionately harming lower-income families? These are not partisan questions, they are practical ones. Today's ruling forces a reality check. Without the legal authority to impose broad emergency tariffs, the administration is left facing a challenge of its own making. How do you defend a trade strategy when its legal spine has been declared invalid? How do you maintain political momentum when your primary economic weapon has been taken off the table? But here's something I can say confidently. Pressure brings out the true character of leaders. Some respond with humility and adjustment. Others respond with escalation. I don't yet know which path President Trump will choose, but based on the history we've observed, I have my suspicions. Tomorrow, markets may rise or fall based on how investors digest the ruling. Some stocks may soar on the expectation of lower input costs. Others may plunge because they built entire business models around tariff structures that are now gone. That's the nature of markets. They adjust, they recalibrate, they price in new information. But people don't adjust as quickly as markets do. And trust takes a very long time to rebuild. I've always believed that America's strength lies not in any single policy, but in our ability to learn, adapt, and correct course. The court's ruling is a correction. But what comes next will determine whether it becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long, exhausting story. For now, I'll leave you with this. Leadership isn't measured by how loudly a president fights or how fiercely Congress argues or how passionately commentators speak. Leadership is measured by results, tangible improvements in the lives of people who will never appear on the evening news. If today's turbulence leads to better policy, then perhaps the shock was worth it. If it leads to more chaos, then this ruling will be remembered not as a safeguard, but as a siren. I hope with all the experience a man my age can offer that it becomes the former. As night finally settled over Omaha and the last of the reporters stopped calling, I sat in my office a little longer than usual, thinking not about the headlines that would run tomorrow, but about the deeper shift happening beneath them. When you've watched America as long as I have, you learn that the most consequential moments aren't always the loudest. Often they begin quietly, triggered by a ruling, a turning point, or a decision that forces the nation to confront its own contradictions. The Supreme Court's decision to block President Trump's tariffs may have felt sudden, even explosive, but it didn't appear out of thin air. It came from years of stretching executive authority to its limits. It came from Congress avoiding hard choices. It came from public frustration building to a point where some institution finally had to say, this is enough. I thought about Henry Kissinger, a man with whom I shared many conversations. He often said that diplomacy is the art of controlling chaos. Politics, however, has become the art of amplifying it. Watching the reaction from Washington today, I couldn't help but feel that some leaders are more comfortable with turbulence than with clarity. The White House in particular seemed caught off guard. I saw clips of advisors stepping to the podium with expressions that betrayed more anxiety than conviction. They spoke of rebuilding the tariff framework, of alternative executive authorities, and of maintaining pressure on China. But to my ears, these didn't sound like strategies. They sounded like improvisation under duress. I've always believed that stability is the oxygen of markets. Remove it and the air gets thin. But politics thrives on volatility because volatility creates narrative. It gives people something to cheer, to fear, to argue about. And in today's America, narrative often matters more than outcomes. The problem is that while politicians play their narratives, ordinary families live the consequences. A young couple in Michigan doesn't care which statute the White House used to justify tariffs. They care that the price of a refrigerator jumped by $200. A farmer in Iowa doesn't care which justice authored the ruling. They care that their soybeans sat in silos while China bought from Brazil instead. A small business in Arizona doesn't care about legal precedents. They care that their supplier doubled its costs overnight. And now, as the consequences of the ruling ripple outward, they are all asking the same question: what happens next? I expect the administration will continue searching for ways to resurrect its tariff agenda, perhaps through national security exemptions, perhaps through pressure on Congress, perhaps through threats, bargaining chips, or executive maneuvers we haven't seen yet. I've lived long enough to know that when a president gets boxed in, he doesn't surrender. He widens the box. But the court made one thing clear today: the Constitution still draws limits, even for presidents who dislike limits. I imagine President Trump won't say this out loud, but deep down, he understands that this ruling changes the battlefield. He built much of his economic identity around tariffs. They became a central pillar of his message, a symbol of reclaiming American power. Now that pillar has been kicked out from under him, and he must rebuild the narrative before it collapses. Even though today's ruling hit the administration hard, it might ultimately help the country because America has been drifting toward a dangerous form of economic nationalism, one that promises simple answers to complex global problems. Tariffs in their broadest form offer that illusion of simplicity: tax the imports, punish the rivals, rebuild the homeland. It's a seductive idea, but seduction is not strategy. You can't build lasting prosperity by threatening supply chains. You can't improve competitiveness by raising costs. You can't win a global economic contest by pretending America exists in a vacuum, and you certainly cannot impose emergency measures indefinitely and expect the judicial system to look the other way. As the office lights dimmed and the city quieted, I found myself thinking of the past. I remembered the steel tariffs of the early 2000s, the Japanese import restrictions of the 1,980 seconds, the rail shutdowns of the 1,970 seconds. Every era had its crisis. Every crisis had its policy response. But in each case, the policies worked only when Congress, the courts, and the president cooperated. That's what worries me now. Cooperation has become an endangered species. Watching today's reactions, I saw pundits frame the ruling as a victory for Democrats, a blow to Republicans, or a humiliation for President Trump. But that's the wrong lens. This wasn't about parties. It was about principles. And the most fundamental principle of American governance is that no branch holds absolute authority, not even when the political winds seem to favor it. But even with all the turbulence swirling around, I remain optimistic. Maybe that's my nature. Maybe it's the years I spent investing in businesses built by ordinary Americans. Or maybe it's because I've seen this country survive worse storms than this. We made it through the inflation crisis of the 1,970 seconds. We made it through the dot-com crash. We made it through the 2008 meltdown when even I felt the ground shake beneath the markets. Every time the American people absorbed the blow, adjusted and rebuilt, because resilience, not regulation, not tariffs, not executive orders, is the real strength of this country. The Supreme Court ruling won't fix our economy overnight. It won't reverse price increases. It won't reduce the political polarization that has turned every policy debate into a battlefield. But it is a moment of clarity, a reminder that constitutional limits still matter, a chance to reevaluate what kind of economic future we are building. If I could speak directly to every family watching the headlines tonight, I'd say this: don't let the noise distract you from the long game. America's strength is not measured by tariffs or disputes or political theatrics. It's measured by innovation, productivity, education, infrastructure, and the willingness of people to invest in themselves and in one another. That's why this moment matters. Not because tariffs were blocked, but because the country was reminded that accountability still exists. Before I left the office, I glanced one more time at the alert on my phone, the one that had shaken the political world this morning. Supreme Court blocks Trump's tariffs, White House in panic, and for the first time since I saw those words, I felt a sense of calm. Not because the chaos had ended, but because the correction had begun. Tomorrow, I'll go back to reading annual reports. I'll look over valuations. I'll call a few CEOs. I'll drink my usual Coke. Life will go on. Markets will adjust. Politicians will react. Commentators will spin. But beneath all that, something more important has happened. The guardrails held. And for an old investor like me, that is worth more than any headline. Because no matter how turbulent the politics become, no matter how dramatic the crisis appears, no matter how loudly leaders shout across the aisle, America always works best when its institutions remember who they are. Tonight they did.